Let's try it louder. Good morning, everyone. All right. Hey, that was great. That's the best good morning I've ever heard back. So mark that down. This is a historic day. That was great. So good to be here with you this morning. I'm glad to be here. I hope you are too. We've been talking the last few weeks leading up to different parts of Jesus' life, discussing different days in the week before he's crucified. And so last week we looked at a verse where Jesus basically said that his work was accomplished. We didn't spend a lot of time on it, but think about that. How is that possible? He hasn't been arrested yet. He hasn't died yet. He hasn't raised. He hasn't done these other things he'll do. But the reason Jesus could say that is it was all but done. Nothing was going to stop it now. Jesus had done what he needed to do. The wheels were in motion, and it was all but accomplished. And now this week, today, as we study the things we're going to look at, we really see the truth in that shine through, because Jesus is done. He's done with his teaching, both public and private. He's done with his miracles, except for the greatest one that he'll ever do. And by and large, his ministry is done. In the next few minutes of his life and in the next day, the next 2 or 3 days, he will have moments where he teaches, but it's largely by example, by the way he's living, by what he's doing, by the life that he's giving up. But his public ministry, his life that we've studied just every detail of as much as we could for this whole year, and as we've seen his 33 years so far, by and large, that's done. And now the wheels are in motion, and Jesus will die for the sins of the world. So as we look at what we're going to discuss today, we see Jesus' last few moments before he's betrayed and before he's arrested, and then we see both of those things happen this morning. The first thing I wanted to look at is the locations. And we know that he left the upper room, and he walked towards the Mount of Olives, to a specific part of the Mount of Olives called the Garden of Gethsemane. So I just wanted to show you some pictures of those areas before we get into the new information. You remember as he left Jerusalem, and he probably passed or even went through the Temple Mount area, he went through an area called the Kidron Valley. And this is a picture of what that looks like. Nothing very special, just like we would assume a valley is. On one side, Jerusalem slopes down into it, and then on the other side, the Mount of Olives slopes up from it. Now, during the winter, there would have been water that ran through these areas. Not so much anymore, but especially back then, there would have been water that came through these areas. But Jesus and his disciples walked through in April. And I looked up the weather in Jerusalem, even now, just to see what they said about the weather in April in Jerusalem. And there's only about 4 days a month that it rains. And even then, less than an inch combined. And so Jesus and his disciples would not have gotten wet as they walked through the Kidron Valley. But here are a couple other pictures. This one a little more lush, probably closer to the rainy season. And then this third one that shows a little more dry, maybe kind of what we have in mind. But he walks through the Kidron Valley across the Kidron Brook, and it probably took him about 15 minutes to get from the upper room to the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, to give you some context, it would take us about 15 minutes to walk to the Martha Berry Museum from here. So that's about the length of the walk that they had when they left the upper room. And Jesus did all that teaching that we've looked at the past 2 weeks, especially that section in John that's not shared anywhere else, those last final moments as they walked. The Kidron is a brook that you see pop up in the Bible from time to time. It's actually a place that would have been kind of famous to them. The Kidron is the brook that David crossed when he ran from his son Absalom, who was trying to kill him. You remember David was a great king, but he made a lot of mistakes. And that's encouraging for us, because we can know great people mess up sometimes. And it can give us hope and tell us don't give up. But David made some mistakes, and because of that, he paid for it. And one of the ways he paid for it is his son rebelled against him and tried to kill him and take the kingdom. Can you imagine? And so as he runs away from his son and he leaves Jerusalem, he goes over this same brook that Jesus and his disciples crossed, the Kidron. There was a fight between Absalom and David. And in that fight, that battle for the kingdom, there was a man named Shimei, and he cursed David. I mean, he basically took Absalom's side. I mean, I guess he thought, hey, Absalom's going to win. When the dust settles, I want to be on the winning side. I'm with Absalom, and he cursed David. Well, we know that's not how it worked out. Absalom died, and David became king, great king. And so after that, he kind of had to backtrack, and he was quick. I think the Bible says he was the first one to come to David and to apologize and to cast his allegiance with David. And because of that, David forgave him, but he didn't really trust him. And so he told Solomon, he said, keep an eye on him. And so Solomon set a boundary for Shimei. He said, I'll trust you, but don't ever leave Jerusalem. The furthest you can go is the Kidron Brook. If you pass over that, our truce is broken, and I'll kill you. And Shimei, later in his life, did cross the brook going to find a servant of his who had left, and he was killed because of it. After Solomon was king, you remember Saul's the first earthly king, then David, then Solomon. The united kingdom that David had worked to establish and Solomon had kept eventually split and became divided. You remember Solomon's sons did not reign as well as he did and caused basically a civil war, a division in the countries. And now there will no longer ever be one united kingdom until we're united in the church, Acts chapter 2. But in that split, the north never had another good king. Now the south had a good king occasionally. Most of the time they were bad, but sometimes they were good. But one of their kings, Asa, the second king of the south, he was a good king. His mother was not a good woman. She had idols that were set up all throughout the kingdom. And so Asa took those idols and he destroyed them. Well, where did he destroy them? Right here by the brook Kidron. And that was such a memorable event in the history of Israel that a lot of times when the priests or the prophets would destroy an idol, they would bring it to the brook Kidron, they would set it on fire, they would grind up the ashes, and they would throw them into the brook. So this was a place that idols were destroyed by God's people. And so that kind of gives us some context to this area and just puts it in our mind how special of a place that it was. Now, as Jesus crosses over, he's going to go into the Mount of Olives. You know, we have a lot of mountains around here, a lot of hills around here. And so it was that they had hills that surrounded Jerusalem, and this was one of them. This is a view from the Mount of Olives looking back towards Jerusalem. And you see the gold structure. Some of you probably know what the gold structure is, an Islamic center now. But you can see how easily Jesus and his disciples would have been able to see back to the temple, because that's where the temple would have been in Jesus' day, is in that location. And so this is what it looks like looking from the Mount of Olives back towards Jerusalem. Now, in Bible times, when David was fleeing from Absalom and he crossed the Kidron Brook and the Kidron Valley, he went up the Mount of Olives just like Jesus and his disciples do. Now the son of David goes up the mountain. In Ezekiel 11:23, it says this about the Mount of Olives. The glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood on the mountain that is on the east side of the city. That's the Mount of Olives. Now it says the glory of the Lord left Jerusalem and stood on the Mount of Olives. So now the glory of the Lord goes up the mountain again. And this is the same mountain where the Lord would also ascend back into heaven one day after his resurrection. And the mountain had trees of all kinds on it. In Jesus' day, no doubt olive trees, thus the name. And at the time of Jesus, even to today, there was also a cemetery that was on this mountain. Now, this is a view from Jerusalem looking back towards the Mount of Olives. So you can see, it's no huge mountain. We would have been able to walk up that, most of us even pretty easily. Hey, Scott, would you grab me a bottle of water? I'll owe you one. All right, and then this is a picture of the Garden of Gethsemane. As Jesus went up the Mount of Olives, he went into a specific area that we know as the Garden of Gethsemane. We don't know a lot about it. It doesn't come up a lot of other times in Scripture. Gethsemane is a word that just means oil press. So maybe there was an oil press nearby, but when you have in mind Jesus, and as we talk about these things in a few minutes, think about this. This is the area that he would have been in, something like this. Maybe not as well manicured, but here's some different pictures, different parts of the Garden of Gethsemane. And then here's one that's a little older with a little less manicured work in it. But here's an artist's rendition that I thought was really powerful that maybe can sit in our mind as we think about Jesus, his final moments before he's betrayed, before he's arrested, and as he prays the prayers that we're going to look at. And so I'm going to leave this on the screen for just a minute. Now, if you take notes or you're curious about exactly where we'll be, let me read these verses to you. Thank you. Matthew chapter 26, verses 36 through 46. And really, if you just want to go to one place and stay, that's where we'll mainly be. Matthew 26, 36 through 46. We'll also look at Mark chapter 14, verses 32 through 42. Luke 22, 39 through 47. And then John 18, 1 through 2. But again, if you just want to turn one place and kind of stay there with us, Matthew 26 will be where we're at. We're going to discuss the three prayers that Jesus made in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, we looked at a prayer last week, the high priestly prayer in John chapter 17, and I told you Trenton was going to preach on that, and then you know what that jerk did? He changed his lesson topic right at the last minute. So you may have gone and looked and said, well, what's going on? Well, that's what it was. He changed his mind. Of all the nerve. That's okay. We won't hold it against him. But that prayer is one that Jesus prayed either as he walked with his disciples, in front of them for sure, before they got to the garden. But now Jesus goes off by himself and he prays these three different distinct prayers. The first one, and like I said, if you'll start in Matthew 26 with me, look at verse 36. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, James and John. Now, when they come into the Garden of Gethsemane, picture this in your mind, Jesus leaves 8 of the disciples, or the apostles, at the entrance most likely. And he takes 3 with him a little further into the area. Who is that? His inner circle, his inner council. I mean, we as the church have each other collectively, but we also need to have groups of people that we can trust, that we can confess sin to, that can hold us accountable, that encourage us, that strengthen us. And so that's what this group was for Jesus, his inner circle, if you will. Even among the 12, his closest friends and co-workers. And so he takes Peter, James, and John with him. And then Jesus leaves them a little distance and goes off to himself. It would have been about 10 or 11 as they came into the garden, probably. That was pretty normal for their culture. You usually stayed up late on Passover night because you told all the stories of God's redemption. And so it wouldn't have been anything out of the ordinary for them to stay up late on Passover night. But that was pretty late in their culture, and it's very late in my culture. If I'm up at 10 or 11, I don't want to be up at 10 or 11. And so you can see why they might have been tired, as we'll see later, but it's a little later in the night. And verse 37 finishes, "He began to be sorrowful," talking about Jesus, "and troubled. Then he said to them, 'My soul is very sorrowful, even to death.'" If you will, make a note, if you're taking notes in your Bible, by that verse, and put Psalm 116, 3 through 4. So Psalm 116, 3 through 4, and then verse 15 as well. So let me read those 3 verses for you. It says, "The snares of death encompassed me. The pangs of Sheol lay hold on me. I suffered distress and anguish. Then I called on the name of the Lord. O Lord, I pray, deliver my soul. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints." So this psalm that was written so many years before, we see possibly having its fulfillment in Jesus, but at the very least, Jesus referencing back to this same idea, the same anguish that the writer no doubt would have had. And now Jesus is sorrowful to the point of death. And I'm thankful this psalm says that precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. So let's look at prayer number 1. I'm going to bring in Luke chapter 22 here. It adds a little more detail. "And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and he knelt down and prayed, saying, 'Father, if you're willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done.'" If we add this from Mark 14, it says, "Going a little further, he fell on the ground and prayed." So you see how Jesus walked into the garden? He knelt down and fell on his face. Have you ever had a prayer where sitting down just wouldn't cut it, standing up just wouldn't cut it, but you just fell on the bed, you fell on the ground, you fell on the floor? That times probably a million is the anguish that Jesus was dealing with. And so his prayer would have been one that's possibly the most emotional prayer that's ever been prayed. And no doubt Jesus looked something very similar to this. So as he falls on the ground, he prays, "If it's possible that the hour might pass from him." And he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will." And back in Matthew 26 says, "Going a little further, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, 'My Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but you will.'" What I want us to note from this first prayer is, have you ever thought about this? Jesus did not want to do this. Not this way. If he had his choice, he would say, "God, I want to accomplish the mission. I'll be faithful even to the point of death. I'll do anything you ask me. But if there's another way that this will, your will, could be accomplished, this great scheme of redemption that's been worked out from before the foundation of the world, the things we see through Genesis, all the way marching up to this point in time," Jesus says, if there's another way, let's let it work that way. But he finishes with, "But not my will, but yours." But you see, Jesus, he's looking for another way. He would like another way if it's possible. And then look at verse 40. Still in Matthew 26. "And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, 'So could you not watch with me 1 hour?'" You know, they probably stayed up late all the other Passovers, don't you think? I mean, that was their tradition, their custom. They probably stayed up till 9, 10, 11, midnight maybe, even into the next day as we count time, telling the stories of God and of God's people and of how God had helped their family. And so I'm sure that they had stayed up late and had no problem doing so those other nights. There's a Jewish custom that whoever you're celebrating the Passover with, the first person that falls asleep, that dissolves the gathering. So it would have been a lot of responsibility on you to stay up to keep the party going, to keep the discussion going, to keep the walk down memory lane going. And so they had probably stayed up late all of the other Passovers. They should have been able to stay awake this time. But we'll find out why they couldn't soon. Verse 41, Jesus says, "Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation." He said, "The spirit is willing." I know you really want to. And Paul's even going to write later in life, right? What I want to do, I don't do, and what I don't want to do, I do. And so he says, the spirit is willing. I know that you want to, but he says your flesh is weak. Pray to God in these final hours, these final moments, that you'll be strong when temptation comes, because it's going to come. All right, prayer number 2. We'll start in Mark 14 for this one. Mark 14:39. "And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words." So Mark tells us that his prayer consisted of the same things. But then Matthew adds something a little different. Matthew 26:42 says that in addition to those same words, he said this. "Again, for the second time, he went and prayed, 'My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done.'" So do you see the slight progression? Jesus goes from prayer 1 saying, "God, your will be done, but if there's another way, let's use that other way. Because I know what's set before me, and I'll drink the cup, but I'd rather drink another cup if that's possible." But in the second prayer, he's already resigning himself to the fact. He says, "If this cannot pass, I'll drink the cup. Your will be done. I don't want to do this, but if it has to be done, your will be done." You see that slight progression that Jesus makes as he prays? And then look at verse 43 of Matthew 26. "And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy." All right, prayer number 3. Matthew 26, again, verses 44 through 46. "So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words again. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, 'Sleep, take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand.'" And so Matthew tells us that that third prayer was made up of very similar words, the same words that maybe the first two had been made up of. But then look at what Luke adds. Something Matthew leaves out, Luke adds. Luke 22, verses 43 through 47. It says, "And there appeared to him," and this is in that third and final prayer, "there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him." Now, you might want to, beside that verse, Luke chapter 22, verse 43, you might want to make this note, Hebrews 1:14. Okay, Hebrews 1:14. So here's what Hebrews 1:14 says. Now, if I just told you this and didn't show you the scripture, you might say, Matt's a little wackadoodle. Matt's going a little liberal. Well, let's just see what the Bible says. All right, Hebrews 1:14. It says that angels are ministering spirits sent out to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit eternal salvation. Okay, so angels are ministering spirits sent out to Christians. Now, angels helped Jesus in the garden here in this third and final prayer. They strengthened him. How? I have no idea. And really, you don't either. Hebrews 1:14 tells us that as Christians, angels help us and minister to us and strengthen us and do these different things. How? I have no idea. And you don't either. But it gives me some comfort to know that not only do I have God in heaven who created me and is watching out for me and doing things I can't ever understand and may never understand, but at least this side of eternity. I have Jesus, the Son, who is petitioning for me to the Father. He's my mediator. I have him doing all these things. I have the Comforter doing things, the Strengthener, the Helper, doing things on my behalf, having given me the Word so that I can study for myself and I don't have to have questions. But I also have angels doing something, ministering somehow, strengthening somehow. How? I have no idea. But that gives me some comfort to know God is doing so much for me on my behalf, even right now. And so just as angels helped Jesus, maybe not in the same way, but just as angels helped Jesus in the garden, in some form, some fashion, they help us today. And that's an amazing thought. Now look back at Matthew 26. Look at verse 44. It says, "Being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground." Did you know that you can be in such anguish physically that you can actually sweat drops of blood? That's a rare medical condition. It's called hematidrosis. You can look it up, Hema. We're familiar with hema, like hemoglobin, all those different things. Tidrosis, hematidrosis. But if you Google that and you click on the images, you will see people who have what appears to be sweat coming down their arms, like they've been working out, or down their face, but it's red. And the reason for that is they're not sweating normal sweat, but in addition to that, they're also sweating blood. And our sweat glands, and that sounds awful, doesn't it? Our sweat glands, they're surrounded by these tiny blood vessels. And we can get so stressed out. We can be so overwhelmed, we can have so much anguish and sorrow that that our sweat glands can get bigger and get smaller and go back and forth to the point where they rupture the blood vessels. And then it infuses into the sweat glands. And the cause is extreme anguish. That's what causes this rare medical condition. Now, this verse says that his blood became like great drops of blood. So maybe Jesus was sweating blood. That's very possible from a medical standpoint. Or maybe he was in such mental pain and anguish that it was like he was sweating blood. But either way, can you see how hard of a moment this was for Jesus? The strongest man that's ever lived, and this is the position that he finds himself in. Why? This is a lot to handle. Jesus is in anguish and in pain. Look at verse 45. And when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping for sorrow. The NIV says, exhausted from sorrow. So just as Jesus was dealing with things, the apostles were dealing with things too. It wasn't that they didn't understand the gravity of the situation. It wasn't that they didn't care. It wasn't that they were lazy. It wasn't even that they hadn't slept in 24 hours, which is possible. But they were exhausted from sorrow. Have you ever had a day that was just so rough, you had nothing left at the end of it? You just fall into bed. You don't have to take a melatonin. You don't need any kind of calming agents. You just fall right to sleep because you're so exhausted from the sorrow and the hardness of the day. That's how the apostles were. They were having a rough day, and they were exhausted from it. And so as they slept, it was really because they couldn't help it. Verse 46, he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Rise and pray that you may not enter into temptation." And then Luke 22, verse 47, adds an interesting detail. It says, "While he, Jesus, was still speaking, there came a crowd." Things are about to change immensely and immediately. The past 2 days have been defined by quiet, by calm, by peace, by teaching, by spending some time together. The last few minutes... Yes, Jeremy. All right, great. All right, so if you couldn't hear, Jeremy's question was, what do you think Jesus meant when he said, "Pray lest you enter into temptation"? I think the key is the verse where he said, "The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." I think he was telling them, he's already told Peter, "You're going to deny me." And Peter says, "No, I would never." And Jesus says, "You will, and here's what's going to happen, the order it's going to happen," things like that. And he also tells the other disciples, "When I leave, you're going to scatter. When the shepherd is taken, the sheep will be scattered." And so I think he's telling them, you've got a real spiritual battle that's about to come. Satan is trying to win your souls. We know what's going to happen with Judas. The same thing easily could have happened with Peter. You don't think Peter for a split second at least thought when he denied Jesus, well, it's over, I've lost, I'll give up. That's what Judas did. Now I'm sure Jesus would have reconciled that relationship if Judas would have let him. But he chose not to. And that was prophesied, I guess, a long time ago anyway. But I think Jesus is telling them, you're about to fight a great spiritual battle. Now's not the time to sleep, but now's the time to pray, to be mentally prepared, and to be asking God for help. Anybody have anything that they would add to that? So Michael said, stay praying so you stay strong, so you stay faithful. Ron, what do you think? All right, Jeremy, what do you think about that? Larry, go ahead. Yep. Yep. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so Larry added to that, Jesus was praying. He was praying for himself even, and he was asking the apostles to do the same. Jeremy, anything to add to that? Yeah. I don't know. Jeremy asked if when you told him to stay awake, if that was a command. I mean, he told them to, so it sounds like a command to me. And they hadn't done it. So very possibly. All right, thank you for the question. All right, so now the last 2 days, as we mentioned, have been quiet. They've been defined by peace, by calm. And the last few minutes had been tough on Jesus because he knew what was about to happen. He knew the storm that was about to come. And now it's here. Think about this. What did you do 5 days ago? I don't even know what 5 days ago was. I'd have to do the math. But in that Tuesday, Wednesday ballpark, what did you do 5 days ago? I would have to really sit down and think about it. And I would have to rule out like what I did Thursday and Monday. It just all runs together to an extent. But 5 days ago is really not that long. If we thought about it, we could figure it out. And if we did something memorable, it especially feels like it wasn't that long ago. This is Thursday night or Friday morning as they count time. It's only been 5 days since Jesus rode into town on a donkey to the applause of the masses and greeted his king. It's only been 5 days since he wept over the city, since he turned over those tables, since he's done his final public teaching in the temple, since he celebrated the last Passover, even just hours ago, the last true Passover and the first Lord's Supper. But now doesn't all that feel like a lifetime ago? Doesn't it feel like it's a million years away? Judas has now brought an army to arrest the Prince of Peace. Now I want to get some feedback on this. See if you've ever thought about this. Have you ever thought about why the Jews needed Judas to betray Jesus? Why do you think they needed Judas? Why was that? I mean, if they wanted to kill Jesus, why not just kill him? Why do they need Judas? That's right. So as Larry pointed out, Jesus, this is not the first time they've tried to kill Jesus. What was the difference? Well, before Jesus, it's not time. We're going to do things on my timetable. I'll give you the choice, but if you choose to kill me, fine, but we're going to do it when I am ready for it to happen and not when you're ready for it to happen. It may look like and feel like you're in control. You're not in control in the least. And Larry's pointed out that Jesus has already tried to escape 3 times, or has escaped 3 times. They go to get him and he's gone. And so his point is that they're bringing Judas in because they realize that they need some help. All right, great. Anything else that comes to your mind why they might have needed Judas? Okay, access to Jesus. Great. All right. And I think those 2 things are key. Let's read a few verses that really pull this out. And you can turn to these or I'll just kind of jump around because this will be a quick point. But Matthew 26, 14 through 16 says this. So back up just a little from where we are. Then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?" And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, he sought an opportunity to betray him. So Judas was very calculated. He was looking for a time when he could get Jesus and it would work. All right, Luke 22, 39, talking about Jesus. And he came and went out, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. So when Jesus went to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray, this was not the first time he had been there. This was Jesus' custom. He would get away from the people, from the masses, from the city life, and he would spend some time alone. You know, there's a good quote that I've heard, and I'm going to approximate it, but somebody who's wise doesn't spend all their time with people or all their time alone, but they do some of each. And so that's how Jesus was. He spent a lot of time alone. So it was his custom to go into the Mount of Olives. You know who would have known that? Judas. In John 18, verses 1 through 2 said, "When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden. He and his disciples entered." Verse 2, "Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples." So, exactly what Larry said, they needed access to Jesus. Who better to get that access, to know exactly where he would be and when he would be there, than one of his apostles? And then let's add this. Matthew 26, 47 through 48 says this. "While he was speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and elders of the people. I read this. I didn't have time to research it, but it said during the Passover they would not have been allowed to carry clubs because you're limited to the amount of work that you can do. So it's just amazing that these guys who are so concerned with blasphemy are blaspheming the Sabbath. So you can see they don't care about spiritual things. They have their own ulterior motives in mind. Now, verse 48, the betrayer had given them a sign. The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him. So the Jewish guard, the temple guard, was the one arresting Jesus. Some people think Romans were involved in that as well, in this group that came to arrest Jesus. Would all of these people unmistakably have known Jesus? I mean, if you're a Roman and you're not Jewish and you've never even heard of Jesus and you come to arrest him, are you going to even know which one he is? You know, there are people that see a crime committed and then they have the lineup and they have a hard time picking the guy out of the lineup. How are some people that have no business in the Jewish world, no interest in the Jewish world, going to come and arrest Jesus and know who he is? But even second to that, even if it was just the Jewish temple guard that came to arrest Jesus, it's night. Now, it's not pitch dark. There would have probably been a full moon or close to a full moon at this time of year at the Passover. But it was dark enough. So the key is this. Judas showed them who it was and where he was. The Jews needed Judas because, like Larry said, Jesus has already escaped. They don't want any escapes this time. They need to know where he is, to know exactly who he is in a crowd in the dark of night. And Judas shows them who it is and where he is. All right, now let's look at this betrayal. All right, back to Matthew 26, verses 47 through 50. While he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I'll kiss is the man, seize him." And he came up to Jesus at once and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and he kissed him. And Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you came to do." If we add Luke's account, Luke 22:48, Jesus said to him, "Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" If we add John's account, John 18:3 through 9, it adds this. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. And then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus said to them, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. And when Jesus said to them, "I am he," they drew back and they fell to the ground. So he asked them again, "Whom do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he, so if you seek me, let these men go." And he said this to fulfill the word he had spoken, "Of those whom you gave me, I've lost not one." So Judas comes to Jesus in the crowd of his disciples in the dark of night while he's talking to them, interrupts the conversation, and kisses Jesus and greets him. This would have been a typical greeting for a friend or family member to give someone that they loved, or for a student to give a teacher that they respected. So what Judas did is especially heinous. It's like giving someone a hug so that you have access to stab them in the back. Jesus talks to Judas and he gives him another reminder, another chance. Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? Friend, do what you came to do. Right until the end, Jesus is forgiving and willing to give Judas a chance to change. So then as we link these verses together, we can see what happens. Judas steps back into the group of soldiers and Jewish officials, and Jesus asks them, "Who are you looking for?" And someone answers, "Jesus." Now, what does Jesus say in John chapter 18? You remember verse 5, verse 6, verse 8 that we've just looked at? When they say, "We're looking for Jesus," what does he say? He says, "I am he." Now, Jesus may just be saying, "I'm the one you're looking for." Very possible. But he might also be reminding them that he is God, like he did in John chapter 8, verse 58, quoting back to what God had said in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 14. Remember in Exodus 3:14, God, really I think Christ before the birth, speaking to Moses, whoever it is, deity for sure, says, I am the I am. He sends Moses into Egypt to bring back God's people, to get them out of slavery. And Moses says, well, Pharaoh's going to say, who's sending me? And you tell him the I am, the eternally existing one, the one that had no beginning and will have no end, that is all sufficient. And so they asked Jesus basically, who do you think you are in John chapter 8? And he says, I am the I am. Well, what's the reaction? They pick up stones to kill him. Well, why? Because they knew what he was saying. He was saying, I'm God. You want to see what God looks like? He has come down, put on flesh, and he's dwelling among you. So it could be that Jesus, as God, is giving them one final reminder before he's killed. I am the I am. All right, and then let's look at his arrest. Matthew 26, verse 50. Then they came up and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand, drew his sword, and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, put your sword back in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he'll at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? Luke adds this, Luke 22:49. And when those who were around saw what would follow, they said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, no more of this. And he touched his ear and healed him. John 18:10 adds this. Then Simon Peter, so Peter is the one we should have known. That's in line with his character to act first and think later, for better and for worse. Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. And that servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? So Jesus had said, let this cup pass from me. And now he says, I'll drink it. Yes, David? Yeah, so David's pointing out a verse that we didn't, I don't even know if I've read it, but we definitely didn't look into. Jesus had told them to sell some of their belongings and to buy swords. And so they said, well, we've got 2. And Jesus said, oh, okay, well, that's enough. So what is the point from that? How do we take that? And Jesus is now saying, hey, put the sword away, don't use it. I think it comes down to this. Jesus is telling them, you need a sword for protection. Because what's going to happen soon after I leave you is you're going to take the gospel into the whole world. You're going to go to places where there may be no roads, there may be no spiritual inroads, where you may have no friends. You're going to be going through places like the Good Samaritan was going through, the bloody way, that road from Jericho to Jerusalem where thieves and robbers hung out. You're going to be going through places like that. You need to take a weapon to protect yourself. But they say, well, okay, we've got 2. And Jesus says, hey, great, that'll be enough for the group. Jesus is saying, don't mount up. This is not a physical war, it's a spiritual war, but at the same time, you do have the right to protect yourself. And I actually think it's a pretty powerful verse for people that want to talk about self-defense from a Christian perspective. Can we ever protect ourselves? If someone comes in our house, are we allowed to protect ourselves and our family? Well, I think that's what God is telling the apostles to do here. Don't go for a fight. We're not in a physical battle, but you have the right to protect yourself. Anybody have anything to add to that? Yes, Larry. Yeah, that's a great point. So Larry said, as Peter cuts off the ear, Jesus de-escalates the situation, as he often did, and he healed the guy. Even in his final earthly moments before he's killed, what's Jesus thinking about? Someone else. And we see that on the cross as well. He could have really escalated the situation. I mean, if he had not done that, what do you think would have happened? The apostles probably would have been killed. At least the majority of them. They might have gotten 1 or 2 of the other guys. But unless Jesus stepped in. So great point. All right, so Jesus had said, let this cup pass from me. Now he says, I'll drink this cup that has come from my Father. Peter had planned to fight for Jesus. But Jesus tells him, look, the fight won't be like this. This isn't the kind of fight that we're getting into. Jesus will die. And he tells Peter, basically, we will fight this battle in a different way. Now, is Peter cut off the ear of Malchus? Do you think he was aiming for his ear? Yeah, I mean, I don't know. We have no way to know, but I mean, common sense tells you probably not. I mean, what a good shot if he was. I bet he was aiming for his neck and Malchus moved out of the way, would be my guess. But ask yourself this, why wasn't Peter arrested? Why wasn't Peter arrested? Well, I'll tell you why. They didn't want to have to call Malchus as a witness. They didn't want to call Lazarus as a witness. They didn't want to call anyone as a witness that was an actual witness. They wanted to bring in people that were willing to fabricate and trump up charges against Jesus. And so Peter wasn't arrested because they didn't want to bring Malchus into it, because they didn't want further proof to people that Jesus was who he said he was. You know, they came with a lot of men. If Jesus had wanted to go, one man would have been enough. And if he didn't want to go, the whole world wouldn't have been enough. Jesus said he could have called 12 legions of angels. If you do the math, that would have been 72,000 angels. You know, we sing he could have called 10,000 angels. I read about the story about the guy that did that song. He had been a worldly entertainer doing like pop songs and country songs. And he decided, I want to be a Christian. I want to do like some Christian stuff. And so he wrote this song. And when he did, he didn't do any research into what a legion of angels was. He just remembered this story from his childhood. And so he said he could have called 10,000 angels. Well, really, Jesus is saying he could have called 72,000 angels. But really, there's no limit. So 10,000 is as good as 72,000, I guess, because he could have called the whole host of heaven. Now, why do you think Jesus said 12 legions of angels? Why not 11? Why not 13? Now, I really have no idea, but I think he was saying I could call a legion of angels for each of us. Each of the remaining apostles and for myself. And we would all be protected. I don't know that that's the case, but that's what makes sense to me. All right, let's try to finish this last section. Matthew 26, verses 54 through 55. It says, "But how then should the scriptures be fulfilled that it must be so? At that hour Jesus said to the crowds, 'Have you come out as against a robber, with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you didn't seize me.' And Luke adds this in chapter 22, 'When I was with you day after day in the temple, you didn't lay hands on me. But this is your hour and the power of darkness.'" So Jesus points out, you could have arrested me in the temple at any time, but you're doing it this way because you're doing it for evil reasons and in evil ways. There was nothing legal about this. There was nothing moral about this. Everything was hypocritical and against God's law and against the law of their day. And let me mention this. This will be the last thing we do. Look at Matthew 26:56 says this. "But all this has taken place that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples left him and fled." And Mark 14 adds this. "And a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body. And they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked." That's just an interesting little detail. I mean, it doesn't matter for doctrinal purposes, right? But why is that little detail added there? When John wrote his gospel, what did he often refer to himself as? Instead of saying John was there, blah, 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 what did he call himself? What was the nickname he gave himself? Or maybe divinely given. But what was John's nickname in his gospel? Anybody remember that? All right, the disciple that Jesus loved. Matthew, the name Matthew means gift of God. How do y'all feel if I start saying, the gift of God is here? No, nobody wants that. But John tagged himself, really an act of humility, just calling himself the disciple that Jesus loved, okay? So he left almost like a little calling card within the gospel itself. Now, in the Gospel of Mark, this is the only one that adds this detail about the young man who was seized, left his garment, and ran away naked. Why would this little detail be in there? Well, I think it might be because Mark put himself into the gospel in this small way. In Acts chapter 13, verses 4 through 5. So you might want to make this note by Mark 14, 51 and 52. Acts 13, 4 through 5 says this. "So being sent out by the Holy Spirit, they went down to Seleucia, and from there they sailed to Cyprus. When they arrived at Salamis, they proclaimed the word of God in the synagogues of the Jews, and they had John to assist them." Now this is not John the disciple, John the apostle, but John Mark. Okay? The same one we're saying might have been the one that ran away naked. So John Mark went on this mission trip with them. Now Acts 13:13. "Now Paul and his companions set sail from Paphos and sent to Perga and Pamphylia, and John left them and returned to Jerusalem." You remember that story, right? They went on this mission trip. John Mark went with them, and halfway through the trip, he left. left him holding the bag. Dude, you're supposed to do this job and this job and this job, and you've left us high and dry. How are you going to feel about somebody who does that? All right, Acts 15, 36 through 41, so later down the road a few years. And after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, let's return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are. Now Barnabas wanted to take with them John called Mark, but Paul thought best not to take him with them. The one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia had not gone with them to the work, and there arose a sharp disagreement so that they separated from each other. So Paul says, I'm not taking that guy. Barnabas says, we have to. Paul's disagreed so much, he said, fine, you go on a mission trip by yourself, you pick whoever you want, and I'm going to go over here and do it with the people I trust. And Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commanded by the brothers to the grace of the Lord, and he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. So instead of one mission trip, now we have two. Romans 8:28, all things work together for good. But I'll do this quickly and we'll be done. Do you remember the last book that Paul wrote right before he's killed? 2 Timothy. And 2 Timothy 4:11 says this. At the end of his life, one of the last things Paul writes, get Mark and bring him with you, for he's very useful to me for the ministry. So who wrote one of the Gospels? John Mark. John Mark did. Which John Mark? The one that had been a little boy that ran away from the crucifixion scene of Jesus to get away and to save himself. The one who had left a mission trip and left the group really in a rough spot. The one that Paul said, I don't want him to go so bad, I'm not even going to go on the mission trip with you. You get whoever you want and go, and I'll get whoever I want and we'll go. But later in his life, because Barnabas put his arm around him and didn't give up on him, God didn't give up on him, he didn't give up on himself. At the end of his life, one of the last things that Paul writes is, get Mark and bring him with you, for he's useful to me for the ministry. And Mark ended up writing one of the 4 Gospels. You know, when people walk with Jesus, when they see Jesus, they can change. Our past mistakes don't have to define our future. You know, if you mess up in life, don't feel like you can't get back in the game. It's never too late to reconnect with someone you've let down, and it's never too late to forgive someone who let you down. So this is the story of John Mark. All right, next week we'll look at Peter's progression, and we'll look at the trials of Jesus. Thanks for your comments and questions.